Little House on the Prairie. The next chapter is called Prairie Fire. Okay, spring had come. The warm wind smelled exciting, and all our outdoors was large and bright and sweet. Big, white, shining clouds floated high up in the clear space. Their shadows floated over the prairie. The shadows were thin and brown, and all the rest of the prairie was pale, soft colors of dead grass. Pa was breaking the prairie sod, with Pete and Patty hitched to the breaking plow. The sod was a tough, thick mass of grass and roots. Pet and Patty slowly pulled with all their might, and the sharp plow slowly turned over a long, unbroken strip of that sod. The dead grass was so tall and thick that it held up the sod. Where Pa had plowed, he didn't have a plowed field. The long strips of grass roots lay on top of the grass, and the grass stuck out between them. But Pa and Pet and Patty kept on working. He said that sod potatoes and sod corn could grow this year, and next year the roots and the dead grasses would be rotted. In 2 or 3 years, he would have nicely plowed fields. Pa liked the land because it was so rich, and there wasn't a tree or a stump or a rock on it. Now, a great many Indians came riding along the Indian trail. Indians were everywhere. Their guns echoed in the creek bottoms where they were hunting. No one knew how many Indians were hidden on the prairie, which seemed so level but wasn't. Often Laura saw an Indian where no one had been an instant before. Indians often came into the house. Some were friendly, some were surly and cross. All of them wanted food and tobacco, and Ma gave them whatever they wanted. She was afraid not to. When an Indian pointed at something and grunted, Ma gave him that thing. But most of the food now was kept hidden and locked up. Jack was cross all the time, even with Laura. He was never let off the chain, and all the time he lay there and hated the Indians. Laura and Mary were quite used to seeing them now. Indians didn't surprise them at all anymore, but they always felt safer near Pa or Jack. One day, they were helping Ma get dinner. Baby Carrie was playing on the floor in the sunshine, and suddenly the sunshine was gone. "I do believe it's going to storm," Ma said, looking out the window. Laura looked too, and great black clouds were billowing up in the south across the sun. Pet and Patty came running from the field, Pa holding the heavy plow and bounding in long leaps behind it. "Prairie Fire!" he shouted. "Get the tub full of water! Put sacks in it! Hurry!" Mary ran to the well. Laura ran to tug the tub to it. Pa tied Pet to the house. He brought the cow and the calf from the picket line and shut them in the stable. He caught Bunny and tied her fast to the north corner of the house. Ma was pulling up buckets of water as fast as she could. Laura ran to get the sacks that Pa had flung out of the stable. Pa was plowing and shouting at Pet and Patty to make them hurry. The sky was black now. The air was as dark as if the sun had set. Pa plowed a long furrow west of the house and south of the house and back again east of the house. Rabbits came bounding past him as if he wasn't there. Pet and Patty came galloping, the plow and Pa bounding behind them. Pa tied them to the other north corner of the house. The tub was full of water now. Laura helped Ma push the sacks under the water to get them soaking wet. "I couldn't plow but one furrow. There isn't time," Pa said. "Hurry, Caroline. The fire's coming faster than a horse can run." A big rabbit bounded right over the tub while Ma and Pa were lifting it. Ma told Laura to stay at the house. Pa and Ma ran, staggering away to the furrow with the tub. And there's a picture. So they dug, a furrow is like, it's almost like a little moat, like they're trying to make water so that the fire can't cross the path of the water. And Pa was going to try to do it all the way around their house, but he couldn't. The fire was coming too quickly. Laura stayed close to the house. She could see the red fire coming under the billows of smoke. More rabbits went leaping by. They paid no attention to Jack, and he didn't think about them. He stared at the red under the sides of the rolling smoke and shivered and whined while he crowded close to Laura. The wind was rising and wildly screaming. Thousands of birds flew before the fire. Thousands of rabbits were running. Pa was going along the furrow, setting fire to the grass on the other side of it. Ma followed with a wet sack, beating at the flames that tried to cross the furrow. The whole prairie was hopping with rabbits. Snakes rippled across the yard. Prairie hens ran silently, their necks outstretched and their wings spread. Birds screamed in the screaming wind. Pa's little fire was all around the house now, and he helped Ma fight it with the wet sacks. The fire blew wildly, snatching at the dry grass inside the furrow. Pa and Ma thrashed at it with sacks when it got across the furrow and stamped it with their feet. They ran back and forth in the smoke, fighting the fire. The prairie fire was roaring now, roaring louder and louder in the screaming wind, and great flames came roaring and flaring and twisting high. Twisting high, flames broke loose and came down on the wind to blaze up in the grass far ahead of the roaring wall of fire. A red light came from the rolling black clouds of smoke overhead. So Pa and Ma were trying to burn some of the grass around the house so that the fire would stop. Because if the grass goes all the way up to the house, then the fire will come closer to their house. So they're trying to burn some of the grass down so that the fire will stop and not keep coming towards them. Mary and Laura stood against the house and held hands and trembled. Baby Carrie was in the house. Laura wanted to do something, but inside her head was roaring and whirling like the fire. Her middle shook and tears poured out of her stinging eyes. Her eyes and her nose and her throat stung with the smoke. Jack howled. Bunny and Pet and Patty were jerking at the ropes and squealing horribly. The orange, yellow, terrible flames were coming faster, faster than horses can run, and quivering light danced over everything. Pa's little fire had made a burned out black strip. The little fire went backing slowly away against the wind. It went slowly, crawling to meet the big, furious, big fire coming. And suddenly, the big fire swallowed up the little one. The wind rose to a high, crackling, rushing shriek. Flames climbed into the crackling air. Fire was all around their house. And then it was over. The fire went roaring past them and away. Pa and Ma were beating out little fires here and there in the yard. When they were all out, Ma came into the house to wash her hands and face. She was streaked with smoke and sweat, and she was trembling all over. But she said there was nothing to worry about now. The backfire saved us, she said, and all's well that ends well. So the backfire was the little fire that they were making, she and Pa. And they're using potato sacks soaked to like stamp out the fire. That's really smart. Be like getting a wet towel and like stamping out the fire. And there's Laura and Mary and Jack huddled up against the house while this is happening. So scary. The air smelled scorched, and to the edge of the sky, the prairie was burned, naked and black. Threads of smoke rose up from it. Ashes blew on the wind. Everything felt different and miserable, but Pa and Ma were cheerful because the fire was gone and had not done any harm. Pa said the fire had not missed them from far, but a miss is as good as a mile. He asked Ma, if it had come while I was in Independence, what would you have done? We would have gone to the creek with the birds and the rabbits, of course, Ma said. All the wild things on the prairie had known what to do. They ran and fled and hopped and crawled as fast as they could to get to the water that would keep them safe from the fire. Only the little soft striped gophers had gone down deep into their holes, and they were the first to come up and look around at the bare, smoking prairie. And there's a picture of them poking up. So they went underground, down into the dirt under the fire. And now they're poking back up. Then out of the creek bottoms, the birds came flying, and rabbits cautiously hopped and looked. It was a long, long time before the snakes crawled out of the bottoms and the prairie hens came walking up. The fire had gone out among the bluffs. It had never reached the creek bottoms or the Indian camps. That night, Mr. Edwards and Mr. Scott came to see Pa. They were worried because they thought that perhaps the Indians had started that fire on purpose to burn out the white people. Pa didn't believe it. He said the Indians had always burned the prairie to make green grass grow more quickly and to travel easier. Their ponies couldn't gallop through the thick, tall, dead grass. Now the ground was all clear, and he was glad of it because the plowing would be easier. While they were talking, they could hear drums beating in the Indian camp and shouts. Laura sat as still as a mouse on the doorstep and listened to the talk and to the Indians. The stars hung low and large and quivered over the burned prairie, and the wind blew gently in Laura's hair. Mr. Edwards said there were too many Indians in those camps, and he didn't like it. Mr. Scott said he didn't know why so many of those savages were coming together if they didn't mean devilment. The only good Indian is a dead Indian, Mr. Scott said. Pa said no. He figured that Indians would be as peaceful as anybody else if they were left alone. On the other hand, they had been moved west so many times that naturally they hated white folks. But an Indian ought to have some sense to know when he is licked. With soldiers coming now at Fort Gibson and at Fort Dodge, Pa didn't believe these Indians would make any trouble. As to why they're congregating in these camps, Scott, I can't tell you that. Maybe they're getting ready for their big spring buffalo hunt. He said there were half a dozen tribes down in those camps. Usually the tribes were fighting each other, but every spring they made peace, and they all came together for the big hunt. They're sworn to peace among themselves, and they're thinking about hunting the buffalo, so it's not likely they'll start on a war path against us. They'll have their talk and their feasts, and then one day they'll hit the trail after the buffalo herds. The buffalo will be working their way north pretty soon, following the green grass. By George, I'd like to go on a hunt like that myself. It must be a sight to see. Well, maybe you're right about that, Ingalls, Mr. Scott said slowly. Anyway, I'll be glad to tell Mrs. Scott what you said. So, as you can see, Pa is definitely more sympathetic towards the Indians, and he understands why, they wouldn't like the white people.